Hello to all the participants. I am Floriane Morin. Claire Brison, Olivier Schintz, and me are very happy to welcome you back this afternoon for the Conference Globale Provenance last panel, returning from causes to consequences. A special welcome to all those who join us now. Don't hesitate to take a look at the previous webinars. They're available in video on Global Provenance website until the end of February. If human rights and museum responsibility gave the color to our conference with the keynote interview of Professor Christian Carpenter, the terms of repatriation, return, restitution were its keywords along with provenance research, whatever the announced perspectives of the previous webinars was. This morning, we discussed the very definition of this notion of restitution and what it implies in terms of relations and dialogue between those who should give back and those who should receive. But finally, between a certain decolonial utopia and the lack of understanding of what constitutes heritage for the source communities and the diasporas, how to interact with accuracy. With our four guests this afternoon, we will explore the circumstances of heritage restitution and its repercussions with practical examples of governmental issues towards heritage spoliated during colonization and with an international prominent research initiative dedicated to looted archaeological heritage in Yemen, if Alexander is joining us. It's our pleasure to introduce Marc-André Renold, who accepted to chair this panel between students' exams and the beginning of the conference he organized, What Prospects for Orphan Works? Reflection on Cultural Goods with No Provenance. This two-day online event begins on February the 5th. We will share with you the streaming link. Marc-André Renold, who studied in Geneva, Basel, and Yale, is an ordinary professor at the University of Genève, responsible for teaching art and cultural property law. He was also associate professor from 2006-2019, lecturer at the University of Genève from 2003 to 2006, visiting lecturer at the Graduate Institute of International Studies of Geneva and at the Duke Geneva Institute in Transnational Law in 2005. He was visiting professor at the University of Paris between 2006 and 2007. He also directs the Art Law Center and an institution dedicated to research and teaching of legal issues relating to works of art and cultural property. In addition, since 2012, he has held the UNESCO chair in international law for the protection of cultural property. Marc-André, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Floriane. Thank you for this kind introduction. Congratulations on the team that you form and that you has enabled the setting up of this amazing conference. I've participated to a maximum that I could. I missed this morning, today's other panel, unfortunately, due to exams that I was, as you said, had students who were taking exams, but I'm happy to be here this afternoon with a great panel. So we will be speaking about restituer des causes aux conséquences, or returning from causes to consequences. And let me very, very briefly introduce this. I assume we are going to say the four speakers and not five of today, in the order in which they will appear, first on film, then in real. Well, pseudo-real. Yasmina Zian, who is actually very close to us geographically right now, because she's at the Swiss Forum for Migration and Population Studies at the University of Neuchâtel for this year of research. She is a doctor in history. She's a historian by training, that she did her doctorate between, if I understand well, the Technical University of Berlin and Université Libre de Bruxelles. And so you are going to obviously talk about the situation in Belgium with a, since you drafted a report, and I think you are somehow, if I can see from what you're writing, somehow frustrated on how things are happening in Belgium, but there's hope. So that's the first presentation. Then the second will be by Jos van Beurden from the Netherlands, who is a senior researcher at the Free University in Amsterdam. And for those of you who are connected, you certainly know that he's the author of the Facebook page Restitution Matters, also an email blog on those very specific issues. So he will tell us more on how things are going on in the Netherlands. Another, obviously, another state very much concerned with the colonial history, past and present. We were all hoping that Alexander Nagel would be here, but obviously he isn't. So I'm not going to introduce him. Maybe he will contact us in the meantime. But we will then have a dual presentation with Donna Yates and Pierre Lauzon on the very interesting concept of demuseumification and the return of cultural heritage. They have a lot of experience in many topics, but in particular with regards to South America. So Donna is associate professor in criminal law and criminology at Maastricht University, at the law school there, and is a co-author of a very important work on trafficking culture with top experts such as Simon Mackenzie and Neil Brody. And Pierre is a postdoctoral fellow presently at Columbia, and we appreciate very much your being with us this early for you. And we're also glad that you're not under too much snow right now, although if I understand what you just told me, there is a lot of snow in New York right now. So that's our panels. Just before leading to the brief films that you have all produced, which will now be aired, I would just like to raise one question so that maybe you can all start thinking, connected actually to the title of this panel, Restituer, des causes aux conséquences, returning from causes to consequences. And I'm very interested because terminology is never completely neutral, as translators and interpreters would say. It's interesting to see that the organizers have chosen two different terms. When in French, we talk about restitution, and in English about return. Now, the two terms are often used very indistinctively. I believe, as a lawyer, that they have very specific meanings, but I'll be very interested to know if you, of those of you who are historians, researchers, or lawyers, if for you, this has any meaning. I don't mean to have the whole session on this vocabulary issue, but it could be a good start. But first, let's watch the films.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes et merci d'être là. Merci pour l'invitation aussi. J'ai le plaisir aujourd'hui de vous parler de la restitution, des retours et des traitements des collections des patrimoines culturels extra-européens dans le débat en Belgique. Mais avant d'entamer la question de la restitution, j'aimerais revenir, ou du traitement, j'aimerais revenir sur 3 mythes qui se retrouvent dans les débats. Et le premier mythe, je pense que c'est des mythes importants sur lesquels il faut s'arrêter parce qu'il faut les déconstruire de façon à pouvoir un peu relativiser le poids de ces arguments dans la discussion. Donc le premier mythe dont j'aimerais vous faire part, c'est cette idée que le droit actuel est neutre. Donc il y a des personnes qui disent que la meilleure façon pour répondre objectivement aux demandes de restitution, c'est d'appliquer le droit actuel. Or, le droit actuel, on pourra en parler, mais le droit actuel est évidemment dépendant du temps dans lequel il a été formulé et aujourd'hui, on sait qu'il ne répond pas de façon complète aux demandes de restitution. Le deuxième mythe, c'est la question de l'inaliénabilité des collections en Belgique. Contrairement en France, en réalité, en Belgique, les collections nationales ne sont pas inaliénables. Le troisième mythe, c'est cette idée que si on restitue un jour un objet, on ouvrira la boîte de Pandore et en fait, ça nous amènera à vider les musées. Et donc ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose qu'on entend souvent, parfois sous forme d'humour. Ah, la restitution, on va vider tous les musées occidentaux. Évidemment, c'est aussi un mythe, voire un fantasme. Alors maintenant, j'aimerais revenir sur l'année 2018, parce que c'est cette année-là qui a engagé de nouveaux débats. Il y en avait eu dans les années 1950, il y en a eu dans les années 70 et 80. Et en 2018, le débat est revenu sur la place publique pour 3 raisons. Premièrement, il y a eu la publication du rapport Sarr-Savoie, la diffusion, donc c'est le rapport sur la restitution qui a été commandé par Emmanuel Macron et qui a fait vraiment beaucoup de bruit. On pourra revenir dessus et sur les différentes propositions qui ressortent de ce rapport et recommandations. Le deuxième événement clé en 2018 qui a fait aussi parler de la restitution, c'est la réouverture du Musée royal d'Afrique centrale. Je pourrais vous en parler aussi plus longuement. Donc, c'est un musée vraiment qui a été un musée crucial en Belgique sur la question coloniale et qui a été pendant 5 ans en rénovation et réorganisation. Le musée souhaitait en fait se décoloniser. Et en 2018, il a réouvert ses portes et tout le monde attendait au tournant ce musée pour voir s'il s'était décolonisé et comment est-ce qu'il l'avait fait. Et finalement, le troisième événement important qui a refait parler de la restitution, c'est Michel Bouffiou, qui est un journaliste chez Paris Match, donc une revue très grand public, qui a écrit de nombreux articles sur les collections de restes humains qu'on retrouve en Belgique, et notamment le crâne d'un célèbre chef congolais qui a été tué à la fin du 19e siècle lors des conquêtes coloniales, et qui s'appelle Luzinga. Donc avec ces 3 événements, donc dans la presse, dans le musée et à un niveau international, on a vu en Belgique de nouveau de l'intérêt, un intérêt vraiment assez large et partagé pour s'intéresser à la question du retour des patrimoines culturels. Et ça a amené 3 résolutions. En tout cas, 3 résolutions ont été déposées, 2 ont été adoptées, et on se rend compte qu'en Belgique, qui est un système politique un peu compliqué avec différents niveaux, on a eu une résolution au Sénat, donc au niveau fédéral, une résolution à l'Assemblée de la Commission communautaire française, donc là on est plutôt au niveau communautaire, même si c'est à Bruxelles, et puis au niveau de la région bruxelloise. Donc ça, c'est 3 entités différentes, et c'est vraiment important de le mentionner parce que la question de la restitution se pose à un niveau national, et on voit qu'en Belgique, rien que par sa structure politique, c'est difficile de formuler des recommandations qui sont valables pour le pays en entier. Les retombées de ces différentes résolutions sont de différents ordres. On se rappellera qu'en juin, il y a eu la mort de George Floyd, il y a eu de nombreuses mobilisations Black Lives Matter. Donc, on est vraiment il y a eu des déboulonnements de statuts. Et à ce moment-là, en juin, fin juin, le 30 juin, lors de l'anniversaire de l'indépendance de la République démocratique du Congo, Philippe, le roi des Belges, a déclaré publiquement ses regrets, il a formulé des regrets concernant le passé colonial belge. Et ça, c'est vraiment une première, parce que jusqu'ici, en Belgique, aucun roi ne s'était vraiment exprimé sur la question coloniale, et encore moins en ces termes-là. Le 30 juin aussi, la première ministre a déclaré qu'il y a une commission qui a été mise en place pour examiner l'État indépendant du Congo. Donc ça, c'était quand le Congo appartenait à Léopold II. C'était sa propriété privée, ce n'était pas encore le Congo belge. Et le passé colonial de la Belgique au Congo, au Rwanda et au Burundi. Et dans le cadre de cette commission spéciale qui devra remettre ses recommandations, enfin en tout cas qui devra remettre un rapport en octobre prochain, il y a aussi la question de la restitution, parce que l'objectif de cette commission Vérité et Réconciliation, c'est de permettre d'analyser ce qui s'est passé dans le passé, de proposer des réparations dans le but d'obtenir une réconciliation des mémoires. Alors, je termine sur ce schéma de relations où on voit plusieurs acteurs. Je pense que c'est important, quand on se pose la question de la restitution, de réaliser à quel point cette question est complexe parce qu'elle fait intervenir différents acteurs ayant des intérêts et des stratégies différentes. On pourra plus en parler durant la discussion, mais j'aimerais déjà mettre la lumière sur ces différents acteurs. Il y a les chercheurs, donc on est dans le milieu académique, mais ça peut être des chercheurs au sein d'institutions muséales. Les musées, autant les musées qui sont détenteurs des patrimoines culturels que ceux qui souhaiteraient l'être. Les politiciens et communautés des pays d'origine, les représentants et représentantes politiques en Belgique, l'opinion publique qui joue un rôle très important parce qu'elle peut évidemment influencer tant les musées dans le fait de boycotter par exemple un musée, donc ça peut influencer la politique que le musée va amener, mais aussi les représentants politiques. Et puis alors le milieu socioculturel qui s'engage et qui essaye d'influencer l'opinion publique de sorte à ce que des politiques soient mises en place. Et qui fait aussi le lien avec les communautés dans les pays d'origine. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention et j'espère qu'on aura une discussion très riche.
Hello, good afternoon. I would love to talk with you about the advice of the Dutch Council for Culture on a national policy framework for colonial collections. It was made at the request of the Minister for Culture and published on October 7 last year. The advice states that many colonial cultural objects came to the Netherlands against the will of their owners, and this is historical injustice, visible in many Dutch museums, and the Netherlands should declare itself prepared to rectify it. Cultural goods looted from former Dutch colony must be unconditionally returned if the country of origin so requests. And the Netherlands may no longer impose conditions on what the recipient country will do with it afterwards. The advice suggests a broader range of objects for which the minister must consider restitution. Among them, objects from countries that were not a Dutch colony, but which have a special meaning for that country. But I say beware, because this latter type of requests will not be granted unconditionally. The judgment on it must be weighed up in reasonableness and fairness and consider how important is this object for the Netherlands and for the country of origin. And what about storage conditions and accessibility after return? The advice is progressive and groundbreaking, and this is partially a result of the composition of the advisory committee. Most members were Dutch people, but they have strong roots in former colonies and are able to think from different perspectives. Allow me to make some critical comments. The first one is about provenance research. The advice is outspoken about the need for it, but it fails to indicate how museums can strike a balance between this time-consuming and costly research on the one hand, and the large number of dubiously acquired objects awaiting investigation on the other. Now let me give two examples to explain what I mean. In March 2020, the Netherlands handed over the kris, or stabbing weapon, of Indonesia's national hero, Prince Diponegoro. He was the hero of the early 19th century anti-colonial Java War. Indonesia had asked for it in 1975, and the Netherlands then had agreed to track it down. Only in 2017 did researchers of Museum Volkenkunde really start their investigation. And even then it took them 2.5 years to discover it in their own storerooms. The second example is the canon of the King of Kandy. In that same 2017, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam began a pilot study into 10 colonial objects. And one of these is the cannon from Sri Lanka, captured in 1765 by soldiers of the Dutch East India Company. In 2019, so 2 years later, a museum delegation visited its counterparts in Sri Lanka. The announcement of the delegation upon its arrival, that it had come to do research and not to discuss a return, caused quite some frustration and irritation. A final report is planned for 2021. By then, the canon of the King of Kandy will have been the topic of 4 years of research. The kris and the canon are 2 objects out of thousands that, according to the advice, need to be investigated. Now my question is, and maybe you'll think about an answer with me, should there be some kind of a general pardon for objects that are believed to be spoils of war, so that room is created for research into other objects? My second comment is on the European perspective. The advice mentions both the Washington Principles for dealing with Nazi-looted art and the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but it fails to raise the question whether similar principles or a similar declaration is needed for dubiously acquired colonial objects. Do you think it should be there? Should like-minded countries in Europe come up with an initiative for it? To be frank, my experience in the Global South is that such a Europe-wide initiative could restore some of the distrust created in the colonial and post-colonial period. And trust building is one of the most crucial elements in the whole restitution debate. Thank you very much.
The return of cultural heritage objects is a growing practice worldwide, fueled by demands from source countries whose cultural heritage has been plundered during conquests and colonial times and is still prey today to contemporary trafficking. Return and restitution claims also stem from recent movements of re-examination of how the collections of European and North American museums were constituted. Return claims often meet with cool responses, when not frank hostility, from many North American and European museums. One argument often put forward to refuse these demands is that the very mission of museums in favor of conservation, preservation, access, research, and education would be jeopardized if their collections were to be depleted from some of their highlights. Implicitly, such arguments envision museums as the ultimate repository of all human cultural and artistic output, and derive from a Eurocentric epistemology that often ignores alternate uses of cultural heritage objects. Indeed, many non-European cultures contemplate wear from use and decay as the normal fate of the objects they produce. Yet, museumification interrupts these processes by positing the preservation of these objects in the name of science. Today, we would like to start a discussion on the concept of demuseumification, whereby the accumulated set of preservation expectations from a piece that has been in a museum for a long time is challenged by alternative practices upon the return of the piece to its country or culture of origin. Demuseumification can subvert the expectation that a returned object remains in the realm of museums, allowing it to acquire new or regain old societal and cultural functions. At least at this point, demuseumification appears as a challenge to the European institutions that, despite of decolonization, still retain the power to decide what is returned, when, and on what initial terms.
In the limited time we have, we would like to bring up the Historical Museum of Berne's 2014 return of an ancient Bolivian statue identified by Bolivians as an accaparé, an important deity in modern Bolivian life. Taken by a 19th century Swiss diplomat and accompanied by the near standard racist collection story of giving indigenous people alcohol, the contemporary significance of the accaparé made the statue a focus of Bolivian repatriation efforts. Upon agreeing to return the statue to Bolivia, Berne required that Bolivia store the piece in an acceptable museum environment. We've collected a number of cases where a promise to maintain the returned object in a museum that meets European standards is presented as a requirement. Some museum return guidelines specifically state that such a requirement should be made during the evaluation of any case for return. Yet such a requirement challenges the idea of a true transfer of control with the handover of the object, allowing for European cultural ideas of the object as a museum piece to be retained, perhaps even in situations where that is socially, culturally, or politically inappropriate. Even in the majority of situations where the receiving country or culture plans on incorporating the returned object into their modern museum system, requiring it still implies some degree of European control. We ask if, to return with such strings attached, is truly a complete return of the object. Is it an act of decolonization when the former colonial or imperial power are still able to mandate that the object stay within European approved contexts, such as the museum? In the case of the accaparé, Bolivia publicly, if temporarily, challenged the stipulation. Upon the statue's return, the Bolivian government attached it to a clear box on top of a car and slowly drove it through La Paz, allowing people to shower it with coca leaves, alcohol, and adulation. Nothing about that met modern museum standards, but the accaparé, at least for that time, fully took on its cultural role for indigenous Bolivians, something that is impossible within a museum.
To conclude, we propose that returns do not necessarily imply a challenge to the current museum order, whereby once museumified, objects may have little chance to revert to their previous social use or to acquire a different one altogether. A decolonized museum implies a shift in practices and discourses that stops imposing conversation standards in the name of science so as to accept alternative visions of how to deal with objects from the past. We ask, to what extent should these museums be allowed to have the last word on the future of the objects after a return has occurred?
Bonjour, good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. The sound is all right. So I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me this afternoon. So the subject of my presentation is Yemen, where we are far from returns in many cases. So it's a perspective on values and archives of South Arabian heritage. And so I first want to start with a disclaimer. Although I'm associated with both the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC and State University in New York, what I'm talking here this afternoon is my own my own opinion and not representing the institution's perspectives, obviously. So I also would like to acknowledge actually the ground where I'm here at New York City, the ground of the Lenape. I dedicate this short introduction to Yemen's heritage to the memory of Mohanad al-Sayani, who passed away last year, who was the head of the General authorities of the preservation also of Yemen antiquities and culture. So we have really now, unfortunately, one person less who helped really also in questions such as restitution of objects from Yemen to Yemen and more. So there are also, this talk is also dedicated to the many Yemenis, be it in Yemen or around the world, who despite really destruction that is still continuing as we speak here today, do not give up and still are hopeful for everyday activities, including at some point going back to museums in their country. So Yemen at the south of the Arabian Peninsula, there are different governments today who pretend also to be acting on behalf of all Yemenis. So we have governments in Sana'a, we have in Aden, we have where there's a Southern Transitional Council. So it's an interesting political landscape that we are dealing here with at the moment. And so this vast country is home to the Great Dam of Marib. Some of you may have heard about this, and we have coffee also, and we have on the island of Socotra famous dragon trees. Obviously, in the last couple of years, because of the weapons sales that are ongoing between the UK, US, and other countries to Saudi Arabia and others, we are having now the situation that school children are in classrooms where there is no much opportunity for them to learn about their past and the wealth that this country once owned. So there was at one point a very rich tradition also of writing, of interest in the past. And I want to quote one of my colleagues who's working with me on this project, that she addresses the issue that you can't be destroyer and savior at the same time, talking to other countries around the world about the participation on this erasure of heritage. So what I present here has briefly been presented in with Yemeni colleagues in 2019 at a UNESCO organized workshop in Djibouti, where I spoke about the history of the project that I've been doing now. And so I want to introduce here briefly the last of the Kataban, then talk about underground to underground and Yemen's past has a future in Yemen for the next about 10 minutes maximum. The last of the Kataban started in 2010. So it was a project that sparked my curiosity how all of these objects that are coming from South Arabia ended actually in the United States. So for surprisingly few people had looked into the market, also how the materials ended up here in which museums. The kingdom I'm talking about, the Kataban, has an ancient capital called Tamna. So between about 500 BCE and 200 CE, Tamna that you see here with the yellow mark is still an existing site today. So here we have, it's in a wadi, the Wadi Beyhan, where we have many modern cities also with museums included. So here we have the site of Tamna. There's a museum on the site also where people store whatever antiquity is found also in the areas. Here we have the southern gate that once allowed people to enter the city. The city itself was explored first already by a European, Eduard Glaser, whose collections actually, so he left South Arabia with massive collections in the 19th century. His objects are today in the British Museum, in Vienna, in Berlin, and other museums. So what you see here is a stone that was left inside a market stone, and Eduard Glaser, today buried in Munich, has one of the key roads actually in these early removal of finds. So the city map here of this site, and about 20 minutes north of the site is a cemetery where all of the people who lived in the Wadi Behan in the past had buried. And this is really where we have all of these objects that are today dispersed around the world in museums. Here we have one object that was sold in 2007 for $1,217,000 US at an auction here in New York, while the estimate was only $400,000 to $600,000. So these prices that we have here obviously gained also with the information that was given, that it was at some point removed from the site. So the Last of the Kataban looks at auction house catalogs since 1931. It focuses on the exchange between collectors, dealers, diplomats, and museum representatives. Also looks into the statements in particular of museum representatives and on museum catalogs. So the archives have now so far revealed about 1,256 individual entries. Since last year, I'm working with the German Archaeological Institute, and as we have now made an agreement with this database to be expanded further. And so there are obviously a lot of antiquities laws or regulations that have been in place since the 19th century until even recently. So we have tribal laws in specific areas, and this one here, no person may sell or otherwise dispose of any interest in an antiquity without first informing the director in writing, and so on, was in the late 1940s. So we have these laws. There are obviously lots of challenges, again, poverty and high unemployment. We have greed, we have provenance information that was withheld for many years. And so we were able to map already really how the materials left. So we have several trade routes that are specifically really tracking down. So we have one that now in recent years actually goes to the Gulf states also, and from there further on to Europe and to America. A second route also that goes through the Eastern Mediterranean, and from there also ending up in America. So we have these specific spots. Also, I've been working also with Homeland Security here in the US and with other entities to map out some of these objects. And we had a few case studies, actually successful case studies already that helped resolving this. We have a museum in Sana, a national museum. There's currently a project with the German Archaeological Institute on helping the local authorities also in creating the database. In Aden, there's a museum, in Mukalla, and we have obviously too many airports also. It cannot be, it is impossible really to track all the time the materials as it particularly relates here to the US. But we know already that in the 1960s in Yemen, people were complaining about the involvements of Americans and the British into the situation of the market. So this is a translation here that I made of a Sana weekly newspaper from 1864. Imperialism has exploited the political conflict in Damar, Americans exploiting the government and the ignorance and poverty of certain people, persuade these people to excavate antiquities and sell them to Americans. So we have already in the 1960s here these voices being more loud. In the US, I'm focusing on two major collections in Washington, DC and in Baltimore. In Baltimore, it is the so-called Giron Foster collection that was acquired in 2006. And in Washington, DC, it's the Wendell Phillips collection that was has been acquired since 2013. And there's obviously much more material from these collections, particularly from Wendell Phillips. And I'm going to briefly introduce him in a second, all over the US and other collections that are mostly educational institutions.
Alexander?
So, yeah.
I am so sorry to interrupt you, but we don't have much time anymore. You can maybe conclude with 1 minute discussion, but that's all. Then we have to share with the other participants. So sure. Thank you.
All right, so I just want to share briefly the number of objects really is extreme. What is striking with Wendell Phillips, that at his death, he had an estimated $470 million a wealth estimate. So he not only excavated, but he was also obviously promoting South Arabian art antiquities. It was interesting for me to learn how this one particular object was promoted in the 1950s after he brought it out of Yemen in newspapers here in the US, and how it ended up now on the ICOM cultural list as a legitimate object that was taken out. And it's interesting when you look at the sponsors, because we have here really major institutions who at the same time were also working with the US government, defense secretary. So this gentleman here, for instance, donated the objects that he received from Wendell Phillips to the Detroit Institute of Arts, where they are today. There are many of other objects, and I'm just gonna briefly actually, so what I wanted to go through was some of these records and talk about these, some of these transactions, how they were returned. Also in one case from New York City, actually to Aden, to the museum in 2003. An interesting case, because one object that was stolen from a museum in Aden was coming laundered also through international authorities, ended up in New York and Sotheby's, but someone at Sotheby's was smart enough really to do some research and learned that it was indeed stolen. It was repatriated, restituted to Aden in the museum where it is today. So here I'm going to stop at this point. So I have a few summaries that I made, but I'm happy to discuss this then at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all for your short films and presentations. And so now we can really start the discussion. And as I mentioned at the beginning, shall we just very briefly start with one question to all the panelists. Do you see a difference between restitution and return? The two terms are used to describe our panel. One, restitution in the French, return in the English. Is that something that any of you would like to expand on?
Shall I start?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that in the Dutch language, we do not have that distinction. That's one.
Lucky you.
Yes. Like in the German language. Now, in my English writing, I try to distinguish between return as a neutral concept, restitution as a concept based on a claim, and also repatriation if it is about human remains. And, you know, it's a very traditional distinction, but it's very helpful in my view. So that would be my answer.
Okay. Would anyone, I see Pierre, you have raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I think the first time I started thinking about this, the possible differences among the three terms, because I would add repatriation into this mix, was actually based on one of the articles that I had read that you had written. So I'm really happy that we can discuss this today. For my own work, I think it became very important to think about the differences among different cases of such claims. I ended up focusing on returns, meaning for me claims that were not covered by any kind of international or national laws. And I think it's very useful to distinguish these cases as returns from restitutions as cases covered by existing laws. I think in English it makes a lot of sense because restitution is also a legal term that is employed for many different cases and not just concerning cultural heritage. And for me, returns are really claims in which a nation state is asking for the return of an object from the past. And that for me distinguishes restitution from a somehow non-problematic ask, because that ask would be covered by existing laws. Whereas in returns comes in the political dimension of the claim about an object that the claimant has no legal ground to ask. And so for me, it is important to distinguish the two. Oh, and also the difference with repatriation, because, and that leads to Donna and my presentation about demuseumification, because in return claims, state authorities are claiming the object, and local or indigenous communities, and I'm going to put quotation mark here, are not or seldom associated with the claims.
Thank you. Yeah, Donna, would you like to follow up on this? Yes.
I broadly agree and disagree with everybody. And to make matters worse, I'm going to throw another R word into it, recovery, which again, we're causing interesting problems. The way I tend to use return is to cover nearly everything. I see it as kind of the blanket term that covers the different type of R words below it. So generally, these are all giving objects, or in some cases, financial recompense, to put another R word. I blame French for these R words. The act of giving something back. And just because there is such fine detail separating these, and in the case of law, some very important differences separating these, I see return as the most blanket term, at least in English, that's currently possible, that covers most cases.
Anyone else to say something? Alexander, yes.
Yes, thank you also. And I agree with Donna and Pierre and Jos also. So being a German native speaker for me, so es ist auch die Rückgabe natürlich. But when we had this meeting with UNESCO in related to Yemen, we were early on actually also addressing the different terms that are being used, and that these terms are obviously changing also throughout research. So I mean, this is something that we thought that at the end of with the discussions in Yemen also, it's not really helpful to have these discussions. And I agree with Donna so much here that it is the return really that I think is a term that we can easily agree upon, that is a very useful one. So, but the linguistic discussions here, I think they only lead us so far. So, I mean, and of course, I mean, people tag me because I'm not a lawyer also. I mean, I've never wanted to be a lawyer also. This was not in my interest. So I can only make my observations here based on those languages that I know. And what is coming, the baggage with these words also. Restitution for me has been in the last couple of years always used as restitution of knowledge more. This is what I've been mostly through this project by Benedict Savoy and others, so that the restitution of knowledge, I think, where we do not speak about return, repatriation so much. So that's just my 5 cents.
Thank you so very much. So we're not going to deal more with this. It's just, I agree, we should not spend too much time on terms, but it's important to remember that sometimes, I've noticed this in my personal experience, you need to know when the person facing you is using a term with a particular underpinning, because then that might lead to avoiding misunderstanding if you can actually know what that person is thinking. But anyway, I would like to, well, I was going to ask Yasmina a question, but go ahead, Yasmina, you're going to add something, yes.
Okay, yeah, I think everything is very important, but in this case, we are in the political context. Sometimes we use return to try to depoliticize the debate. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's very important to say, no, we have to speak about restitution because we have to repair something. And if it's just about the movement of an object from one place to another one, then we don't answer what the people want to hear, and what they want to hear is, I'm sorry about the past. So that's why I have to repair, I have to use the word restitution. So I think return is very, very important and practical, because we can speak about non-legal framework. We can speak about things without a bad context, but sometimes it's used not to admit that something bad is happening.
Thank you. So there again, we see that there is yet another meeting that you have brought up. Now, I'd like to stay with you, Yasmina, because there is a question that has been asked to you. If you could give, so it's a little bit more personal, some explanations as to your mission relating to the report. This is coming from Damiana Otoyu, and who would like to know exactly what will this report serve as a basis for a future law? And if so, are you in charge of drafting it? I assume it is the report, not the law. And the second under question is, have you been helped by Belgian institutions, such as the MRAC or the royal family?
Yes, thank you for the question. I don't know, should I answer in French, because the question is in French?
The question is in French. I translated it because I thought it might be useful, but
I don't know.
Feel free. Je pense que ça va très bien de répondre en français.
Ok, donc la mission, donc en fait là il faut vraiment un peu entrer dans le contexte belge. C'est qu'en Belgique, avant qu'il y ait la commission qui doit travailler sur le passé colonial et donner des réponses pour la réparation, il n'y avait aucune demande de travail sur la question de la restitution, sauf de la part de la communauté française. Donc ça veut dire que ça ne concerne pas toute la Belgique, ça concerne une partie de la Belgique, c'est-à-dire Bruxelles et la Wallonie. Et eux ont demandé à l'Académie royale de Belgique d'écrire un rapport sur la question de la restitution. J'ai été engagée pour écrire un draft. Et donc là, donc pendant un an, d'octobre 2019 à octobre 2020, j'ai réalisé un rapport qui, on l'espère, permettra de créer une loi ou d'écrire une loi. Mais évidemment, cette loi ne pourra être qu'au niveau communautaire, sauf si, évidemment, le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse. Mais effectivement, il faudrait du coup aussi un rapport qui concerne les collections en Flandre.
Est-ce que le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse ou pas du tout pour l'instant?
Alors, le niveau fédéral s'y intéresse actuellement, depuis juin, à travers cette commission spéciale, qui est une sorte de commission parlementaire, mais on l'appelle spéciale, d'une mission d'un an, et là qui regroupe bien plus d'auteurs et de spécialistes que seulement dans mon cadre. J'avais un comité de suivi avec des spécialistes, mais disons que j'ai réalisé le draft. Et donc, je ne sais pas exactement quand le rapport va être rendu, parce que le comité de suivi est en train de le modifier. Je ne sais pas, c'est un comité composé d'académiciens, donc de l'Académie royale de Belgique, qui sont spécialisés dans la conservation, dans l'archéologie, dans les relations diplomatiques. Donc, eux, ils y ajoutent encore des choses. Et évidemment, le but, c'est de le publier pour qu'en Belgique, on ait aussi un rapport, comme il y en a un aux Pays-Bas, en France et en Allemagne. Et donc, j'ai été soutenue par des institutions, comme elles ont pu m'aider, donc des musées qui se trouvaient à Bruxelles et dans la communauté française, enfin en Wallonie, notamment le Musée royal de Marimont, les musées ont aussi contribué à ce rapport. Ils ont aussi eu un regard critique pour décrire leur collection et quelle était la partie des collections qui sont touchées par la restitution ou pas. Et alors évidemment, là c'est vraiment la raison pour laquelle en Belgique c'est un peu compliqué. Le Musée royal d'Afrique centrale étant un établissement scientifique, c'est-à-dire un établissement qui relève des compétences du niveau fédéral, je ne parlais pas du musée royal de l'Afrique centrale parce que ce n'était pas un musée de la communauté française. Donc, ce musée n'est pas directement, sujet des politiques de la communauté française. Et ce qui est un peu absurde parce que écrire un travail sur la restitution en Belgique, mais exclure les collections du musée royal de l'Afrique centrale, ça pose un problème. Et c'est ça que je voulais montrer dans la présentation, c'est qu'en Belgique, du fait que le gouvernement soit fédéralisé, on arrive à des initiatives à des niveaux différents qui empêchent vraiment une réflexion à un niveau national et une politique qui pourrait effectivement arriver à l'écriture d'une loi. Voilà. Désolée d'avoir été un peu longue, mais c'est...
Non, mais la question amenait à un développement long. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Ça montre la spécificité aussi de chaque pays. Perhaps we can move, because you also mentioned it, to Jos. Alexander is raising his hand, but maybe just before that, Jos, if you mind, we've spoken about the Belgian situation. The Dutch, you're not facing similar issues, but you're facing different ones. How far are you compared to the Belgians? Perhaps a little bit more advanced, right?
I don't like to say that we are more advanced than the Belgians.
Not in a negative way.
Operating differs. The Belgians are doing things usually more discreetly. We are more shouting, look at us.
Okay.
Now, in my presentation, I spoke about this advice of the Dutch Council for Culture, and it's quite radical. They say it is really injustice. This injustice has to be made undone, and we have to do something. Now, the good news is that last Friday, the government of the Netherlands, they adopted the advice, which was quite unexpectedly. So in a way, we are a bit running forward, but we have been lagging behind a lot. So, what is happening in the Netherlands, it is interesting, but the point is that, there's a lot of talk about it, but actual returns have been very limited. Like in 2020, there was only one return. I think Belgium had no returns. Germany had, I think, 3 returns. France had the one saber going to Senegal and a promise to the République de Benin, but since then it has been silent. So, there is much talk and there is reason for optimism, but at the same time, I'm quite careful. And I know from my contacts in the Global South that they have very serious doubts about what we are doing.
Now, so the decision of last Friday, it's a political decision, right?
It's a political decision.
And what is the next step, if I may ask?
The next step is, well, that the parliament will accept it. And then, what the museums will start proactively to research their collections.
Okay.
There will be some sort of a restitution committee comparable with the restitution committee for Nazi-looted art. And former colonies, especially Indonesia and Suriname and the Dutch Antilles, they can submit requests for returns. And if it is war booty or if it was involuntary lost, so if they have broadened this definition, it's not only war booty, but it is involuntary losses, then they will get it back unconditionally, without any conditions. But if other countries, like, in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, it has quite a number of objects from Sri Lanka, war booty. We have the Benin bronzes, of course. We have objects from Congo, in Rotterdam especially. Those are conditionally. And then the committee, the advisory committee, will look, what is the interest of this object for the Netherlands and for the country of origin? Is the country of origin able to protect it and to make it accessible? And this is a bit sensitive thing, because I know that in Africa, they get upset about it and they will say, well, this is again paternalism, so that they are judging whether we are able to take care of the objects. So we have made a step forward, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And so far, almost nothing has gone back.
Thank you, Jos. Alexander.
Yes, I just wanted to briefly add also to Yasmina and Jos now. So the situation with the national museums, obviously, and private museums. So, I mean, this is a big issue also here in the US, where we have the Smithsonian Institution is actually, obviously, yeah, it's a government entity in some ways to a certain percentage. Just about the situation in France, also there's a wonderful short documentary that addresses also how government authorities are invested in the restitution for Yemen. There's a Yemeni filmmaker, Kadia Al-Salami, who made this documentary about this bronze man that was showing up in France and at the Louvre, was supposed to was then returned to the Sana Museum, and it's exactly, I think, addressing this issue. So just as a film documentary tip, perhaps, which for those who have not seen this movie.
Could you perhaps give the link if you have it? In the
yeah, I put it in the chat for everyone to see. So I hope it's yeah, there, Kadia.
Oh, great, great! I haven't seen it. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Right. Anyone else would like to comment on this particular issue? If not, I would move to an additional question that has been raised by Geoffrey Aloisi, who's asking what is UNESCO's role, in particular the Intergovernmental Committee for the Return as an intermediary for the restitution. So is the UNESCO the solution, or the question is UNESCO more the solution, or are we moving towards a more bilateral system in which, you know, states 2 by 2 get together and agree on a particular way of going? What would your views be? And I see Pierre's hand being raised. Thank you, Pierre.
En français ou en anglais?
La question est en français, donc on va faire peut-être cette règle-là. On répond en français si la question est en français, si on peut.
Alors, moi, je ne parle pas d'expérience, je n'ai pas travaillé à l'UNESCO. Je peux essayer de répondre à cette question à partir de ma propre recherche en Amérique latine, où j'ai été très surpris en fait de constater l'absence de l'UNESCO des processus de négociation sur les retours, qui s'explique en partie par un commentaire que Yasmina a fait dans sa présentation sur le fait que le droit n'est pas neutre. Et en effet, l'UNESCO n'a aucune compétence sur tous les cas qui couvrent des objets déplacés avant 1970. Donc à partir de là, ça limite beaucoup le champ des possibles de la part de l'UNESCO. Par ailleurs, sur le comité intergouvernemental en particulier, il y a tout simplement le fait que ce comité ne peut examiner que des cas dans lesquels les deux gouvernements acceptent de discuter dans ce forum particulier. Le fait même d'accepter une discussion implique d'une certaine manière que l'État possédant envisage une restitution ou un retour à l'issue de ce processus. Donc, si ce n'est pas le cas, il n'y a aucune chance, il n'y a aucune raison pour cet État d'accepter même le comité intergouvernemental comme forum de discussion. Et enfin, pour aussi utiliser un des arguments que Alexander vient de mentionner, dans de nombreux cas, les musées sont privés. C'est le cas notamment dans le cas des États-Unis. Et donc, l'UNESCO n'est tout simplement pas un forum parce qu'il faudrait que l'État membre prennent le cas à son compte. Il faudrait que le musée privé accepte que l'État parle en son nom au sein de l'UNESCO, et tout ça est très peu probable. Donc, paradoxalement, parce que la Convention de l'UNESCO de 1970 reste, je pense, un document de référence, même s'il est très imparfait, mais paradoxalement, l'UNESCO n'a pas un très grand rôle à jouer dans ces négociations.
Est-ce que tout le monde est d'accord? Alexander, Yes.
Yes, I just can say in my case, the workshop that I've done with my Yemeni colleagues was organized by UNESCO. So there was Interpol was invited, ICOM was invited, and it was all financed by UNESCO. So without them, I would not have been able also to meet the colleagues from Yemen. So I agree also with Pierre in many ways. And of course, every institution has its own history. So as we now learn through many of the recent publications, UNESCO is not as archives are opened, also we learn about who is involved in financial transactions also in the past in UNESCO. So I mean, there's much work to do here too. But as the face of this public face, I agree it is, and for me certainly in the case of Yemen, it has helped to be supported by UNESCO.
Okay, so we have 2 points of view. One in which we have UNESCO relatively in the backstage, one in which UNESCO is very much involved. Any other point of view there? Donna, would you like to say something on that? Or there you go. You're raising your hand.
Sure. Let's see how far I followed Pierre's French. I was just saying my French is at a high school level, but I think I understood, and I actually do agree with him. I think that UNESCO's role, and I think UNESCO would characterize their role as being, as Alex said, a bringer together, a creator of the forums where this discussion can happen. And my own impression of the Intergovernmental Committee for the very, very long name Restitution, or whatever R word we're using for cultural objects. I've attended a few of those. They're very interesting, but they're a forum for mentioning cases, for gaining some publicity about it. But my own experience with return of objects is much like Pierre's, perhaps because we're looking at kind of the same corpus of Latin American materials, where UNESCO there isn't really a space or a role in UNESCO in the negotiation of returns. And to look at the rest of Jeffrey's question, that it isn't even necessarily a bilateral agreement between states, where it's often a state and an institution that ends up making a decision and so on. So speaking at this like bigger state level on both sides, it's not necessarily there. So in a way, I agree with both of them. UNESCO plays a role, but it's more of this creating of a forum, not as a direct mediator in disputes. If anybody has a case where UNESCO was a direct mediator in a return dispute, do let me know. But this is not to criticize UNESCO, more just to kind of think of it as having a different role than direct mediator.
No, it's true. If you look at that committee, mediation was added as one option to be used about 10 years ago, and it's never been used technically. I mean, it's been used, yes, by Greece, but hasn't led anywhere because the UK has not agreed. So it's there, but it's actually not working. We have to just be clear about this.
Marc-André just would like to add something.
Yes, please, Florian.
Just your turn. You can take.
Joss, sorry, you were behind the question, Joss. Yes, Joss, go ahead.
Well, I'm not optimistic about the role of UNESCO. They really did not help, for instance, Sri Lanka in the 1980s with a very, very well prepared return requests. But I want to add another element to the discussion, and that's, I want to refer to the Benin Dialogue Group.
Yes.
You know, between European museums and cultural authorities in Nigeria and some members of the Benin Kingdom. Now, they have been talking for a long while, not very successful. And in 2019, they have split off the aim of restitution. And they said it's a bilateral matter. Now, I remember that the Nigerians, they were quite disappointed about it because they said our purpose with the dialogue was restitution. But because of the changing atmosphere in Europe in relation to returns, it seems I expect that this year or next year, a number of individual museums, I think in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, they will start returning Benin objects. That's the expectations. And I know that the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, which has some 170 Benin objects, they have really prepared already the provenance research. And with the new policy of the Dutch government, it seems that they are ready to start really discussions. And then such a bilateral agreement is more effective. So I think in times of new atmosphere, bilateral agreements can be effective. And I'm sorry to say it, but UNESCO has not been very effective, be it in the past or present.
But how can we speak of bilateral agreements in the case of the Benin objects, because there are so many states involved? I mean, there's Benin, there's Nigeria on one side, but there's plenty of European states. So would you favor one bilateral agreement after another?
There's no choice. Of course, I would favor a Europe-wide agreement, but in these European museums, say on the one side is the British Museum, which is very stubborn, and on the other side, the more progressive ones. And I think it's an illusion to have Europe-wide agreement. So then it's better if several museums come up with bilateral agreements. And I also know from museums in the US and in the UK who are not in the Benin dialogue that they are preparing returns.
Okay.
So there's a little optimism.
Thank you. I think Yasmina has raised her hand.
Oui, sur cette question, c'est un peu étonnant de voir qu'il y a des conventions qui sont signées par de nombreux pays et puis qui n'apportent très peu de résultats. Mais dans les différents positionnements qu'il y a eu favorables à la restitution, on se rend compte que d'un point de vue moral, c'est important que ces conventions existent parce qu'on s'y réfère et que les pays sont censés les respecter. Donc je pense que le rôle de l'UNESCO dans le contexte de la restitution ou du retour ne joue pas un rôle pratique, mais donne un cadre moral pour vraiment ancrer une position qui est presque mondialement partagée. Donc je pense que c'est quand même quelque chose d'important. Si on n'avait pas ça, le positionnement favorable aux restitutions serait plus compliqué à tenir.
C'est difficile encore.
Marc-André, j'aimerais juste lire le commentaire de Saskia Cousin qui se réfère à une discussion que vous avez eue précédemment, mais qui peut revenir maintenant d'une manière intéressante. Saskia nous dit sur la discussion sur les termes, restitution, return, restitution, il est important de savoir d'où l'on parle, from where we speak. Au Bénin, on dit que les choses vont revenir. Il s'agit bien d'un retour. Voilà. Je partage les termes de Saskia.
Merci de nous dire ça. Très important de pouvoir savoir d'où l'on parle, effectivement, d'où l'on parle. Et si on sait, si on comprend, si on écoute d'où parle votre interlocuteur, ça peut beaucoup aider. Merci beaucoup à Saskia. Est-ce que sur ces questions, on these issues of UNESCO's role and bilateral agreements, anyone would like to touch the floor? Now, if not, we have a question to Jos, specifically regarding the 26,000 objects on Suriname in the Tropen Museum, most of them from Arawak. Would the objects returned to the Suriname be returned to the museum or to the indigenous communities? That's a tough one.
Yeah, and I'm very happy that the question is raised, and I would love to hear also the other panelists about it, because I think it's one of the most complicated questions we are dealing with. And this is an example from Suriname, but just the day before yesterday, there came an example from Indonesia, which with the new Dutch policy get back certain royal objects which had belonged to a sultan. And the sultan and his groups around him, they have said, please keep them in the Netherlands, because if they will be returned, they will go to the National Museum in Jakarta. And we only favor a return if they come back to us, to the family or the regional museum. And for me, the problem is that, and the Dutch report, the Dutch government policy does not solve this issue. And I think we need an international conference about it, because the accusation, if we are going to say it should go to a regional museum, of the accusation of neocolonialism, neocolonial behavior will easily come. So we have to take care of that very carefully. And so I don't know the solution, but I think, you know, in many of these former colonies, there is internal colonialism. And that will be a next step. And if any of my colleagues here has a solution for this, please, please, please come up with it, because it's so complicated.
I think Donna Yates has the solution.
Thank you.
I certainly don't have any solution. I wanted to talk very quickly because I think Pierre actually has a lot to say what I'm about to say. But in most cases within Latin America, objects are not returned to indigenous communities. In some cases because they kind of can't be. To have one just a quick example, to go back to Bolivia, a very famous return case were a number of textiles that were illicitly trafficked into the United States, stolen from the village of Caroma in Bolivia in the 1980s. However, normally in Bolivia and by law, anything returned goes into the National Museum system and then is held by the National Museum system. When the textiles were returned, so that the textiles could be returned to Caroma, there was actually a special exception law, a special decree passed in Bolivia that allowed these objects to be given to the Caroma community. And that is a very special exception. So even within these states, it isn't so easy, even when it's very clear that this was stolen directly from a community. But I would imagine, again, something returned from the Netherlands to Suriname would go to the Surinamese state, and then the state would decide under their own laws and needs. But I wonder if Pierre can say a bit more about his experience with indigenous involvement in returns of cultural objects to Latin America.
Yeah, you were nodding, so perhaps you have more to say.
Yes, actually, all the objects that I studied in Latin America, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Peru were pre-Columbian objects. However, there was very little or most often no involvement at all from local or indigenous communities. And one characteristic common to all the cases that I studied is that these objects would only be returned if they were going to a museum. So for example, Yale, after more than 10 years of a dispute with Peru, agreed to return the collection of Machu Picchu objects to Peru, but only to a museum. It's not even clear that actually there would be a local or an indigenous community in this case that would want the responsibility of these objects. Another case also to mention textiles, as Donna did, the Museum of the City of Gothenburg in Sweden returned a collection of Paracas textiles to Peru. And the same, the return was only agreed upon after Peru could provide excellent conditions of care in one of the national museums in Lima. So there's always this, this paradox that even though we are talking about pre-Columbian objects, there is not necessarily an indigenous community interested in the case, and even less involved in it. I saw that happen a little more in Colombia, more than in Peru or in Mexico. Even though, and that's another paradox, state authorities will often mention repatriation laws, and I'm returning here to the differentiation among the three terms, but I've heard that a lot in Latin America, that if, for example, in the United States, there is a law called NAGPRA, that stands for North American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, this law forces federally funded museums in the United States to look at their collection and dialogue with indigenous communities about the fate of the objects. So Latin American state authorities often mention this law as in support of their own claim for objects that can be found in the United States or in Europe, when actually this is a completely different situation, because as Donna mentioned, it is a state asking for the return of objects that are considered part of the national heritage, whereas a law like NACPRA actually considers the repatriation of objects to a local or an indigenous community and not to a state. Sorry if I was a little long here.
No, very interesting.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Yeah, because there are two countries, and it's very interesting examples. It's New Zealand and Australia, in which the indigenous communities, especially in New Zealand, the Maori and Moriori communities, have been given preference in getting back the objects. And there is a perfect role division between the national government, which is financing the thing, the National Museum, which is doing provenance research and which is using its international network, and the communities of origin, which will become the owners, so to say, of the returned Maori tattooed heads. And they have been quite successful, because I think until now, over 400 of those heads, they have come back from Europe and North America to New Zealand. And for the Aboriginals, the situation is getting comparable. So there are good examples in which indigenous communities play a major role in this whole return process.
And to jump in about New Zealand, also not just for human remains, but for returned objects, often the objects then enter into the ownership and possession of the correct iwi or Maori cultural group, but often in collaboration with local and regional museums. The local and regional museums house and preserve the objects, while the iwi retains ownership and access and various forms of control. So it is actually really quite ideal.
May I ask you, in your film, you mentioned a very interesting case about the Akeko. And it's been shown in the streets. What happened after? Do we know? Is it in a museum, or is it somewhere?
Pierre said somebody would ask that question.
There you go.
From what I understand, yes, it did enter the National Museum system, and it is preserved in a museum environment. Bolivia's museum professionals are museum professionals like the world over. The issue is just, it shouldn't have to be. It should be Bolivia's decision what happens afterwards.
Absolutely, yeah.
Exactly. So as far as anybody knows, yes, it's within the National Museum system, which again, by Bolivian law, it actually had to go into the museum system. But it's not necessarily within Bolivian law that it has to be preserved in a European sanctioned museum way, if that makes sense.
Meaning that it could also eventually go touring in the streets again.
Yes, the fine curators and museum professionals there could say that this is the right thing to do, and then there you go. Or, I mean, in theory, well, no. I was going to say, in theory, it could really enter into some sort of more modern and maybe more destructive use. But I think even in Bolivia, that would be a bit edgy.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked the question that you were expecting. Anyone else on all these very interesting and
I see Pierre has more to say.
Yeah, Pierre, yes. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Just to add briefly on this, I think that part of the issue, not the issue, the question stems from the fact that the return process is controlled by museum people. And I understand that, of course, from their perspective, the idea, for example, when textiles are returned, the textiles I'm talking about in the case of the Paracas sculptures, they were funerary bundles. So they were unearthed and they were wrapping mummies. So of course, from a museum person perspective, I can see how the idea of reburying such a textile is very difficult to fathom, because you're losing the object that will allow you to continue your research or to show these objects to audiences. However, I do think that from again, different epistemological perspectives, we need to consider whether this is always the right decision, whether out of respect for past cultures, past or present for that matter, cultures, we need to consider whether there can be other ways or other uses of this kind of objects upon their return to their country and or community of origin.
Alexander?
Yes, I just want to briefly add and introduce one case study related to Yemen, where in 2011, the US authorities actually, they caught objects from Middle East and they repatriated this to Egypt, where clearly on the photographs, this is Yemeni material. So there's an issue here also actually of knowledge production and of knowledge imbalance also. One, I wanted to mention this case earlier already, but we do not teach here also students in South Arabian art. So, I mean, it's probably the same with Donna and Pierre. There's not so much knowledge here that is being shared also. And so who makes then even in these governments, these decisions? So when I saw this, I tried to figure out how did this happen? We need to follow really the knowledge also that is here produced and going back and forth then also. And so this is why I think the whole restitution of knowledge really is a very important discussion that we need to continue here, at least on the US side. This is my experience here with the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Actually, I would have a question to you, Alexander. It's not directly connected to what you just said, but a little bit. There is here in Geneva an object that clearly comes from Yemen, which was part of illegal trade, illicit traffic, came to Geneva via the Emirate States, and has now been ordered to be returned by the public prosecutor here in Geneva. It's sitting here now for several years. Do you know if authorities in Yemen are proactive in wanting to obtain the whatever of the object back or not? And could something be done, or do they prefer to wait and see?
No, they are actually proactive. So the workshop that UNESCO, again, to pay honor here to the organization which made this meeting happen, the Yemeni colleagues were very clear. They laid out case studies also, after which current museum they are going. There is not only in Switzerland, in Lebanon, in the Gulf states, there are places where Yemeni objects are housed. So obviously right now with the situation of the government in Yemen, this is the tricky thing here also, because we have so many different parties involved now who all claim we are the caretakers here. That's why it's also the whole narrative creation here about the Houthis are the bad ones. So this is in the case of Yemen, one group that is always being attacked here as this not the reality. But there are organizations, even here in the US, who make just single groups responsible for looting and for stealing. And obviously then they have no chance. Also, there are, even among those in Sanaa, where the Houthis are currently are, the people fighting for the return of antiquities. So, I mean, this is these myths here that are being also created of just single groups always responsible for theft, destruction. And this is particular in Yemen, where we have the bombing of the museums did not occur by local terrorists. This was clearly Western produced. So, these are all going together, I think.
Thank you very much. Time is running. So I don't, is there any, I see something here. Well, actually, this is exactly what I was thinking. I think I shall conclude, which is also suggested by the organizers. Thanking everyone, thanking the, 70 participants for their very, I hope, interested listening and for their questions. Thanking you all and congratulating the organizers. So now I'll give the floor to Florian, Claire, and Olivier, or Olivier. So I'll let you decide who has the final word among the three organizers.
Merci Marc-André, merci d'avoir modéré ce panel très intéressant. We thank you all for your participation. We are very sad of the ending of our conference. It was a lot of work, but we're very happy about all those exchanges, and we hope there will be, other meetings, other exchanges like that, and then a very, very important network to be built. So I will let now Claire and give us a conclusion for the whole conference. Thank you so much.
C'est pas vraiment une conclusion, c'est juste pour revenir sur quelques pensées. Et avant cela, je voulais remercier tout le monde, le comité scientifique, les panélistes, les modérateurs, ainsi que tous les participants qui ont été très actifs et qui ont posé de nombreuses questions et qui ont permis de riches débats. Brièvement, je voulais revenir sur quelques réflexions qui m'ont marquée. Déjà, je voulais rappeler que la recherche en provenance n'est pas une pratique nouvelle. Elle a été longtemps pratiquée sous le nom d'histoire des collections, mais elle a pris un tournant plus politique dès les années 70, tournant qui perdure encore aujourd'hui. On l'a vu grâce à toutes ces discussions. À travers ces 6 webinaires, nous avons pu traiter du sujet tant d'un point de vue de la méthodologie, de la pratique, de la mise en exposition, de la mise en visibilité, que d'aspects juridiques, comme on a encore fait là maintenant. Et chacune des discussions a été enregistrée et sont disponibles en ligne. Ça, je voulais vous le rappeler pour ceux qui ont manqué certains webinaires. Je voulais aussi revenir sur le fait que dans le fil de discussion, on a eu beaucoup de questions sur la restitution. Le mot est revenu de manière assez récurrente. Il est revenu aussi dans ce dernier webinaire et on a pu avoir des éclaircissements sur les différents termes. Et je tenais aussi à rappeler aussi la remarque de Saskia Cousin qui nous rappelait que selon l'endroit où on se trouve, on utilise différents mots. Et j'espère que toutes ces discussions au cours des webinaires auront un peu un effet de désacraliser l'acte de restitution et de décrisper un peu les esprits sur le sujet parce qu'on sent qu'il y a toujours parfois des réticences et que ce n'est pas encore acquis. On retiendra aussi, comme l'a soulevé Emmanuel Casarero, que la recherche de provenance est un travail de fond qui est souvent mise à l'écart au profit du discours politique et diplomatique sur les restitutions. Enfin, on retiendra également que le rapport Sarsavoie n'est qu'un exemple parmi d'autres. Aujourd'hui, dans ce dernier webinaire, on l'a rappelé, il y a des projets aux Pays-Bas, en Belgique. Il a été, dans le webinaire de ce matin, ce rapport a été aussi assez critiqué. On rappelle qu'il pointe une aire géographique et une typologie de patrimoine, finalement, et qu'il exclut les autres, c'est-à-dire qu'il exclut l'archéologie, il exclut les patrimoines naturels et d'autres encore. Pour revenir encore au webinaire de ce matin, il y avait une chose intéressante concernant la décolonisation, question à laquelle les panélistes ont dit préférer utiliser l'expression « travail décolonial », qui pour eux est moins utopique et plus réaliste et qui nous invite à être beaucoup plus humbles, pour reprendre les mots des panélistes. Et enfin, je voulais revenir sur quelques mots-clés qui ont été énoncés, qui proposent en fait des perspectives pour l'avenir. Le Sustainable Museum, le musée responsable et la démuséification, qui peuvent voilà, être des choses à rediscuter à l'avenir. Je vous remercie encore pour votre participation et je laisse peut-être la parole à Floriane et Olivier s'ils ont des pensées à rajouter.
Pas de pensée particulière, vraiment pour remercier encore une fois l'ensemble de nos panélistes. L'ensemble de nos panélistes d'avoir été là, les modérateurs et toutes les personnes présentes. Nous avons été très suivis en fait pendant tous ces différents webinaires. Ça montre vraiment que toutes ces questions autour de à la fois la recherche en provenance, les questions de restitution sont vraiment très fortes en fait aujourd'hui et suscitent beaucoup d'intérêt. Personnellement, je reste un peu toujours avec cette grande question de savoir si ça intéresse, de quelle manière ça intéresse finalement les communautés sources dont on a essayé d'avoir des représentants ou des personnes qui parlaient en leur nom, ou d'essayer de comprendre véritablement où se situaient les enjeux en dehors, on va dire, des musées, mais véritablement dans les communautés sources. Et je pense que c'est peut-être un des enjeux encore actuels et ça pourrait être l'objet d'un prochain webinaire où on essaye véritablement de comprendre jusqu'à quel point les musées aujourd'hui occidentaux répondre à leurs propres questions, ou essayer de répondre à leurs propres questions, ou répondre à des questions qui viennent véritablement de l'extérieur. Bref, encore toute une série de discussions intéressantes qu'on pourrait avoir ensemble. Voilà, je ne sais pas si Floriane, tu veux rajouter quelque chose, sinon je fais-moi un signe de la tête. Voilà, peut-être je conclus alors au nom de toutes et de tous. C'était vraiment un immense plaisir. Le format virtuel a aussi parfois quand même quelques côtés positifs. Nous avons eu des intervenants du monde entier pendant ces quelques jours. Merci pour tous et à une prochaine.